Thank you for the kind introduction, George. And thank you to the Global Ethical Finance team for the opportunity to speak here today. As Achim has outlined, the Ethical Finance Summit is taking place at a critical time when the COVID-19 pandemic is slowing SDG investment. We agree with Achim that there's a need to reinforce the importance of the SDGs and unlock the financing required. In this context, the G20 Roadmap for Sustainable Finance and the UNDP's work on SDG impact are both very welcome developments. This morning, Dora and I are presenting a closely related work. This work is basically on a model for SDG financing. Now, the IMF has been involved in the Sustainable Development Goals agenda for a while. With other international organizations, we have a close relationship where we often discuss the Sustainable Development Goals as a long-term goal for low-income developing countries. And we've also published previous work. I would point to a paper in 2019 where we looked at the costing of critical SDGs. So we actually looked at how much would it cost for a country to achieve its SDG targets. Now, the numbers that came out there were large. They were in the order of 15% of GDP of investment needed in low-income countries every year between now and 2030 in order to meet the SDGs. In this, we take the macroeconomic perspective. This is very much something that the IMF does. When we go into countries, we look at macroeconomic stability. But there we saw a missing link. And this was assessing development financing in a macroeconomically consistent way. Our work today is filling this gap. We basically have developed a model that allows us to look at SDG financing options. And the model allows us also to answer questions like how much has the COVID crisis set back development, and what can governments do to advance their SDG agenda? And lastly, when can they realistically achieve their SDG targets with and without additional donor funding? Now, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals requires extraordinary efforts from all stakeholders. We know that. In the post-pandemic environment, even more than before. In our work, we assess the current state of play on funding the SDGs in 5 key development areas. This is education, health, roads, electricity, and water and sanitation. And we do this using a newly developed macroeconomic framework and applying it to several case studies. It engages the resource needs, incorporating the impact of the pandemic, and looks at policy options to meet these needs. The note focuses on whether and how the SDGs can be achieved under different policy scenarios and financing options, including domestic revenue mobilization, private sector funding, and support from the international community. The SDGs represent important benchmarks for human development. They encompass broad areas of human and fiscal capital with an emphasis on sustainability and inclusiveness. While advances have been made on the SDG development agendas in different countries, further progress remains paramount. Poverty remains widespread, and many low-income and developing countries are lagging progress on their SDGs. Even on pre-COVID-19 pandemic trends, the world was not on track to meet the SDGs by 2030, as it set out to do in 2015. Then the pandemic struck, sickening people around the world and killing over 3 million, and likely many more that have gone unrecorded. The pandemic also hit the development agenda hard. It plunged the world into a deep recession. A renewed commitment to pro-SDG public policies will therefore be critical to avoid a permanent setback. Now, the IMF and other donors stepped up, greatly increasing lending to low-income countries. But the needs were far larger than even this stepped-up financing. As I mentioned before, in this work, we developed a novel long-term macroeconomic framework to assess development financing strategies. This, in our knowledge, is the only existing framework that allows country teams and policymakers to develop coherent and consistent development strategies. The framework allows the simulation of various development paths consistent with domestic policies to increase available public and private funding for development, and with alternative scenarios for donor contributions. The focus is on the 5 SDG sectors for which a costing exercise has been carried out. And during this presentation, when I say Sustainable Development Goals, I mean the SDGs in these 5 areas in particular. The 5 areas are education, health, roads, electricity, and water and sanitation. These sectors are key for development in any country, and they usually represent a large share of government outlays. And the framework can be used to develop realistic development strategies and assess the long-term impact of shocks. The framework focuses on the real economy and the fiscal sector, is fully dynamic and has a long time horizon, in this case, 2050. The key relationship in the macroeconomic framework is between investment in human capital and infrastructure and economic growth. The global coronavirus pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis is having severe adverse effects. Globally, over 100 million people are estimated to have been pushed into extreme poverty in 2020 alone. And government support has saved life and livelihoods, but governments have had a hard time paying for it. Just as their spending increased, revenues collapsed. And even though most low-income developing countries received rapid support, the needs far outstripped that support. The impact of the crisis on government debt and deficits is therefore massive. And as lockdowns hit particularly the service and education sectors, they affected women, low-skilled employees, and younger cohorts disproportionately. The World Bank estimates that globally more than 90% of all students had their education disrupted. This is costly and the impact is very long-lasting. And by disproportionately hurting women and low-income and low-skilled households, the crisis is also exacerbating inequalities. The IMF's World Economic Outlook estimated that the average Gini coefficient would increase by about 2.6 percentage points for emerging markets and developing economies following the pandemic. That is equivalent to wiping out improvements in equity since 2008. We illustrate the impact of the pandemic on the development agenda through 4 country case studies. We look at Rwanda, Nigeria, Pakistan, and Cambodia. Each can be seen as representing a group of countries with specific characteristics. And all of these countries have made progress on development over the last decade. But progress in Rwanda and Cambodia has been more than in Nigeria and Pakistan. And those 2 countries are also doing relatively better on the 5 SDG sectors that we focus on. Of course, all 4 countries have been severely affected by the COVID crisis, and they've all been pushed into recessions. Now, what has been the effect of the crisis? Well, the additional funding needs to meet the SDGs were already substantial even before the pandemic, but the crisis further increased them. Using our model, we estimate that the additional annual financing need due to the pandemic is about 2.5 percentage points of GDP on average in our 4 countries, mainly resulting from lower tax revenue and higher interest expense. When extrapolated to all low-income developing countries, this would imply additional needs of some $59 billion per year. This is our baseline case. Without additional resources to offset the cost of the pandemic, the SDGs will be delayed by about a year for Cambodia and about 5 to 6 years for Rwanda, Pakistan, and Nigeria. The possible effects of permanent economic scarring would be even more damaging. This is not our baseline case, but rather a what-if scenario. We calibrate the growth impact in the downside scenario so that the long-term growth returns to only about 3/4 of its pre-pandemic potential. On average, such economic scarring would add an additional 1.7 percentage points to the country's financing needs. Of course, it would have even more pronounced effects in the long run.
Thank you, Alexander. Let me now say a few words about what countries can do to actually improve the odds of meeting their SDGs. So as you have heard from Alexander, most countries face an enormous challenge regarding the SDGs, and government policies have a crucial role to play in advancing the development agenda. Structural reforms can boost growth and thus generate more resources for development. Domestic revenue mobilization after the crisis has subsided and improvements in efficiency and governance can also help to finance development. The public sector can also strengthen institutions and improve the business climate that would then enable and catalyze private investment. Spurring growth through structural reforms is crucial. Over the long term, growth is perhaps the most important source for development funding. The 2019 paper that Alexander mentioned estimated that doubling projected GDP per capita by 2030 would reduce the additional spending needs by about 4.5 percentage points for countries. Still, even in the medium term, for many countries, the SDG needs exceed potential domestic public and private resources that point to the vital role that the international community can play in advancing development. So many low-income and emerging markets have relatively low level of tax revenues, as you can see on the left-hand side chart. And with appropriate policy changes, revenues can be increased over time. Raising the tax to GDP ratio by about 3 to 5 percentage points over the medium term through comprehensive policy and administration reforms is certainly an ambitious, but it is an achievable aspiration for many countries. However, mobilizing additional tax revenues will have to await a solid recovery after the crisis. Besides taxes, governments can also increase revenues from other sources by stronger management of government assets. Previous cross-country analysis suggests that a better management of state-owned enterprises, which are actually prevalent in low-income developing countries, so better management could yield about 1 percentage point of additional revenue. Increased efficiency of public spending can also help financing the SDGs. Analysis suggests that the average low-income developing country loses more than 50% of the return on its investment to inefficiencies in its public investment management process, as you can see on the right-hand side. The private sector has a crucial role in developing countries in generating jobs, investment, and government resources. Private investment can make a significant contribution to economic growth and development. The potential for external private finance remains largely unrealized in spite of some promising developments in the last decade, and only a small fraction of institutional investment takes place in low-income developing countries. Policies should therefore support a favorable business climate to catalyze higher private finance. For many projects, public sector support may be required, and countries also need to build up a solid pipeline of infrastructure projects that would be available for private sector financing. So low-income developing countries face a daunting challenge in achieving the SDGs. To illustrate the depth of this challenge, we assess how much a set of illustrative comprehensive reform scenarios can contribute to the financing needs and boost the development agenda. Pursuing tax and structural reforms, spurring private investment, together lowers the financing gap by almost 6 percentage points of GDP. Still, this implies that to reach the SDGs by 2030, on average, the 4 case study countries that we analyzed would need to find additional resources amounting to almost 8.5% of GDP per year. You see the breakdown if you look at the left-hand side chart. While the reforms would not suffice to achieve the SDGs by 2030, they would allow countries to meet the goals eventually. For example, for Cambodia, the reforms would enable the country to meet the SDGs by about 3 years delay, and for Rwanda and Nigeria by about 10 years, a decade later, around 2040. In Pakistan, achieving the SDGs would take even longer, but you still see the impact that the comprehensive policies would have on the per capita GDP on development by 2050. So, as you have seen, additional donor support is critical for the SDG agenda. Donor country support has been fairly constant as a percent of their gross national income, at a level which represents about half of the UN target. Donor countries have also been hit hard by the pandemic, and that put constraints on their fiscal resources. However, gradually building donor support towards the UN target of 0.7% of gross national income over the next decade would release about $200 billion for development. Combined with domestic reforms that I just outlined above, scaling up this donor support to the UN target would make a big difference. It would allow Cambodia and Rwanda to fill their remaining SDG financing gap in the 5 sectors that we mentioned by about 2030-2031. Of course, the impact on individual countries depends on how the development aid is distributed across countries. So to sum up, what we have described today is that low-income developing countries face a daunting challenge in achieving the SDGs. The pandemic has further increased the financing needs, and the long-term economic scarring would make the challenge even more difficult. In a baseline scenario, without further reform efforts, the 4 case study countries on average need additional resources of over 14% of GDP every year between now and 2030 to be able to meet the development goals in the 5 key sectors. Without at least some of these additional resources, some of these countries will not meet the goals even by 2050. An ambitious reform agenda could raise long-term growth and mobilize domestic revenues, while also enhancing equity and addressing climate change. We estimate that ambitious domestic reforms can generate enough resources to fill up about half of the country case studies' SDG financing needs. But even with such comprehensive, ambitious domestic reforms, the SDGs would be significantly delayed without further action. Increased donor funding and continued leveraging of international financial institutions' balance sheets could help fill much of this remaining financing gap. Supporting development with both funding and capacity development is in the self-interest of all. More than half of the world population growth between now and 2050 will come from sub-Saharan Africa, potentially transforming the continent to the most dynamic market in the world. Supporting low-income developing country populations in achieving better lives and livelihoods and getting development back on track is therefore in the interest of all. And finally, just to say a few words about the next steps related to this work that we have been doing. So Alexander described this novel framework that we have developed, and currently we are working on developing an intuitive online interface where the public could also access this novel framework. We are also organizing outreach seminars and workshops to country authorities, regional associations, and international organizations. And here you see the website. We have a dedicated website to the SDG financing work that we have been doing. So on this link, you will actually find relevant material, including the paper that we have described today, the country case studies, and previous papers. And we will keep updating this website. So anything that we produce, including the online tool, we will publicize through this website. So I encourage you all to go and visit the website. Thank you for your attention.